Where are the women? Conversations about women in the music industry. And in this podcast, I will have some guests. And today we have Kaitlin Greer. She will introduce herself. And today we will talk about copyrights. Very important topic, right?
Very important topic. Thank you, Sandra. So yes, as Sandra said, I'm Kaitlin Greer. I am Aussie and I've been in London for nearly 2 years, and I've been a lawyer for over 7 years, working in commercial disputes, so lots of contracts and business-related issues. But over the past 6 months or so, I've been transitioning into the music industry, and I am now working with emerging artists. I've done a music licensing course, and I have noticed that a lot of talented artists, especially women, don't fully understand ownership, income, or control. So I'm hoping that this podcast will be very helpful for the women in the music industry.
Yeah, I hope so. Because this podcast is to build a community and show women that we are together, that we can help each other, and that we can build a successful career in the music if we are together. So let's start with copyrights. So what are the main copyrights in the music industry?
So very important topic from a starting point, as far as copyright in music is comprised of 2 key copyrights. So there's the composition, which is the songwriting, the lyrics, the melody, and then the master recording copyright. And that exists to protect your creative work.
Okay, perfect. And so what are the difference between composition copyright and master copyright?
So the difference is, in the composition copyright, it comprises the lyrics and the melody, and it's owned by the songwriters. So whether that's the people that write the lyrics, the composer, the producer, they all may play part in owning together the composition copyright. And the master copyright is the actual recorded version of the song. So that, depending on how you go about recording your music, you may have a deal in place with a label, for example, and they generally would fund the recording of your music. And in exchange for funding the recording of the music, they then own the master recording.
Okay, perfect. And what protections are in place for these rights in the UK?
So in the UK, thankfully, these rights arise just by way of automatically on creation. You don't have to do anything once these ideas have come to life. They're out in the world. But copyright doesn't protect the idea. It protects the idea once it's come to life, if that makes sense.
Okay. And you were talking about a label. So what is the difference between a label or a record label and a publisher?
Yep. So when you're thinking about the 2 separate copyrights within the song, you've got the composition. We'll start with the composition. So we'll start with the composition. It is generally the publisher that protects the composition rights. So they work with your songwriting, the lyrics, the melody, and the publishers collect royalties that is accrued or earned through exploitation of the songwriting. They might pitch for sync opportunities, and they might also help with collaborations. For example, they might get co-writers in to feature on a track or something like that, depending on who your publisher is. And then on the other hand, with the recording rights, the master, you've got the record label that looks after that. And they generally invest in, once they've invested in the recording, they will also invest in marketing of your music and distribution of your music, whether that's CDs, vinyls, digital, downloads, and also promotion. So all of the marketing.
So let's talk about real business. Why artists lose control of their masters?
So that's a really good question. And I think that when you look at the real life examples of artist stories, it really helps to kind of illustrate and understand how things can go wrong and how to protect yourself from the beginning. And I think when you understand the rights that exists in the music and the way that your music is exploited to earn money, it can help gain a better idea of how to remain in control of music. So, for example, Taylor Swift is a great example. You will have all probably been aware of the fact that she bought her recording or the recordings of her original tracks. That was around June last year. So, background, Taylor entered into a contract with a label when she was 17, very young. And I think it was up to 7 albums that she was supposed to produce with this label. And in the deal that she struck with the label, she retained the rights to her publishing. So she retained the rights to her songwriting, her lyrics, her melody, all of those things. But she exchanged for the value of, the money that she got from that deal, the recording, or the label owned the recordings, the recorded versions. So in exchange for that upfront sum to begin with, she lost ownership of those recorded versions. And then as time went on, she ended up recording Taylor's version because she retained the rights to the publishing, so the lyrics and the melody.
Okay.
And then ultimately ended up earning lots of money from her Eras tour, and all of her fan base got on board and really supported her with the Taylor's version, that she was able to then buy back her original recordings. So she now, I think, by way of owning Taylor's versions and the original recorded versions, has full ownership and control over her music. And I could go on a tangent for a while about her story, but essentially what was most important for her was control, ownership, her music being her legacy, her songwriting being so personally important to her, which isn't always the case. There are some artists who are happy to just create the music, sell it. Their main priority might be more financial rather than the legacy of their songwriting. And then other examples are JoJo. I remember hearing Leave, Get Out when I was quite young.
Yeah.
And then we didn't really hear from JoJo for a while. And the reason for that was she, like Taylor, entered into a contract with her label at a very young age. Similar situation, she had 6 albums to produce. But it got to a point, I think after the 3rd studio album, that the label indefinitely paused the release of her music because the label was going bankrupt, I think. So their financial circumstances were not in a good way. So that meant that she couldn't release any more music because she entered into this deal with them. And so she was completely out of control of, what was going on with her music. So eventually the time of the deal ran its course. And once that deal elapsed, she was then able to start up her own label, which I think she did in collaboration with Warner Chappell or Warner Music Group.
Okay.
And she then released her own music in her own label. So she came back with a vengeance and then had her own creative control again. But I guess these 2 stories, for example, really illustrate how important it is to understand not only the terms of the deal, but what your priorities are and how things can go wrong, to include certain protections for worst case scenarios. And I guess we can only learn through lived examples by way of these other artists that have had these things go wrong, that you can then try and include, some sort of safeguards for the future.
Okay. And according to these examples that you were telling us, should artists try to own their masters? Or what would be your advice?
Well, not so much. I guess it really just depends on what the priority is for you as an artist. Like, when you're entering into these agreements, you may really need the financial boost, and that may be the most attractive thing for you. That may mean the ability to record more music or to live a different lifestyle, or, it really comes down to personal priorities. But I think just being aware of these issues that may pop up, it helps you better understand what your priorities may be, but also, I guess, how to navigate these particular terms as they pop up. So, if your songwriting and your lyrics are really personal and really important to you and it tells your story, you may wish to retain the rights to all of, the recorded aspect plus the publishing aspect. But it really just depends on, how you release your music, whether you can fund the recording of your music yourself. And, I guess it's a case-by-case basis, but it's really important to know what your priorities are, I think is like the key takeaway.
Okay. And do you think, or how can independent artists protect their rights?
So I think from a real 101 starting point, when you're in the studio, when you're writing your music or recording your music, however your music comes about, it's really important to get a split sheet organized as soon as possible. So, for example, if you co-write a song with a composer or a producer, it's really important to have these discussions from the beginning as far as what portion of the song you contributed to. So when you're talking about, registering your royalty splits to then earn money from your music, these discussions are really important to have quite early, because there's been so many examples where artists will leave the recording studio or leave the songwriting studio and they won't record the splits, and then a song will go viral, for example, and it'll start earning a lot of money, but the money will have nowhere to go because you haven't recorded what the royalty splits are.
Okay.
And so these royalty collection societies, which we can touch on maybe in another episode,
Yeah. Sure.
They will just have to hold the money in what's called the black box, and it won't get distributed where it should be. So split sheets, number one, and registering those with the relevant organization, so PRS or PPL. And
we will talk about that.
We will also talk about that in another episode. But I guess also when it comes to, depending on how you distribute your music, especially in the digital age, making sure that all of your metadata is up to date and it's complete. All of the fields are complete. So making sure that you've got the relevant codes that you need, the track title's all correct, the artist name is correct, even tags, depending on which platform you're using, that could help with sync opportunities. Making sure that everything is documented as well. I think by way of different cases that have come up in the last 5 to 10 years, there's artists that have had real trouble with proving that they wrote the music and they had their own independent, individual creative idea. So I think by way of lessons learned from others, it's really important to document your songwriting process as best you can, which it's contrary to, wanting to be creative and just on the fly expressing your, creative passions. But if there's a way that you can document this in some form, I would highly suggest that that's a good idea. But also just understanding your deal or whatever it may be that you're discussing, just making sure that you take the time to understand it in the best way that you can.
Okay. And so we're talking about women in this podcast. And we want to advise them. So do you think that are women more vulnerable to unfair contracts in the industry?
I would like to say that it's not necessarily about capability or like a lack of understanding, or that, I don't think people are going out of their way to disadvantage women. I don't think that it's a good idea to kind of go into the music business thinking that, it's going to be an uphill battle. But I think that's why education is so important, because knowledge is power, and it really is true. And access to information, having the right representation or the right people in your corner, people that have, gone through different experiences themselves that can share their stories or their advice. And I think knowledge being power, and that power will help you going into discussions about your music and how you wish to be represented from either a publisher or a label perspective. But I think the industry is definitely improving. And I think especially when there are organizations and community initiatives and podcasts like this that really are focused on empowering women and supporting women and building a community to encourage women to feel empowered and confident and understand the music business. I think it's all coming together to really put women in a position that they feel confident and embracing the ins and outs of the music industry.
Great. And last but not least, if you could give one advice to women in the music business, of course, what would it be?
I think ultimately education, understanding what you're signing, understanding the deal, understanding your priorities, because the ownership of your music, the ownership of your composition, especially, really can shape your future. And you don't necessarily need to have a legal or business background. It's really just asking the right questions and not being afraid to ask questions. Like, no question's a silly question.
Yeah.
And taking your time, I think sometimes, I know from from lived experience, like if you're under pressure, it can be quite hard to make the right decision. And so I think that it really does would benefit people if they just take the time, ask the questions, speak to people, speak to trusted friends and family or within the music community, and make sure that you're getting the support that you need throughout each step of your journey. Because the small decisions earlier on can really make a huge impact long term.
Great. Thank you so much, Kaitlin, for your time, for being here in this podcast.
No, pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And I know it is really helpful for women to get to know how they should protect their rights and how to start in this music industry.
Absolutely. So I think that this podcast is awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. And we started with a name. The name is Where Are the Women? And the women are here to protect each other, here to help each other so we can start a community and being success together. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
And hope to see you in the next episode.
Yes, looking forward to part 2. Stay tuned on all things royalties, payment, and how to get, I guess, the most from your music.
Perfect. Thank you so much and see you in the next episode.